Well, so I guess with that stuff out of the way. So that's we've got all the chit chat, right?
Mhm.
We've all acknowledged each other as
Perfect.
humans.
Yeah.
We've let each other into our hearts. Okay, now we need to tear each
Yeah.
other
I
down,
want you to
destroy each
be.
other,
I
destroy
want
each
you to
other.
be. So I'm assuming we're live then?
Yes, yeah, we've been live for I guess a minute or
Okay.
two.
What's up, everyone? Actually, one last chit chat thing I wanted to say was just a quick shout out actually to your Discord. Um, I've been spending some time in there and I've spoken to some really cool people, some of whom I agree with and some of whom I've disagreed with. It's
Hmm.
always been engaging.
Yeah, I really tried to create a diverse community, I guess is the way I'd put it, because a lot of discords tend to censor basically opposing opinions. And so
Yeah.
there are positive and negative consequences of that, in that I'm sure that my Discord has more Nazis than other leftist Discords. I'm virtually certain of that.
I saw a little bit of that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm sure that there's more Nazi memers and so on. On the other hand, so I recently did like a viewpoint survey, and I don't think it's totally right, but like people reported being out of the ideologies I gave, it was like you got like 43% Democratic Socialist, 38% Anarchist, 11% Soc Dem, and 6% Vanguardist. So not insubstantial amounts of each ideology. I think the tanky one, the Vanguardist one, has got to be higher because there's a lot of really talkative people who are like Vanguardist in my chat. But whatever, that's a
yeah.
whole
I mean,
who knows.
yeah. I mean, Tanky's certainly they're very good at being vocal. I will say.
Sure. Well, so I guess before we
Mhm.
get too into this, let's do the obligatory shill at the beginning. So why don't you tell people who you are, and what you do, and where they can reach you, if you want to shout anything out for yourself or like a media thing in general, like say a book. So either personal or
Mhm.
just general useful media.
So my name is Pranav. It's
Mm-hmm.
spelled Pranav, and it's pronounced
Mm-hmm.
Pruhnuhv. I
Pranav.
am a mhm, perfect, actually. Well done. A lot of people kind of struggle with it at first. I am a social worker.
Mm-hmm.
And I am also a cashier. And I am a communist. I don't like to modify it, but you could say, recognize that I live in the wake of when the word communism at least was used to describe a hegemonic ideology.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of shilling, um, I would say that, at least if we're starting, I would say that there is only one YouTube channel I have found that consistently blows my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And that is Prolet Cult. It is spelled Proletkult.
Mm-hmm. I think I've seen them. I don't know if I watched anything, but
Hmm.
I'll check it
Yeah,
out.
it's good. Hmm.
I'll check
And
it
yeah,
out.
and that's me. Um, yeah, I guess I'm calling in because of the fact that I've been noticing that among all sort of what a left position you feel, I think that a lot of the root of socialism, which is to say, the philosophy of culture, of social organization, and of some even more elemental things in how it was developed, has been lost sight of. I also feel like the idea of dialectical materialism has been thrown out a lot in a way that is quite vague and makes it seem much more complicated than it is. And I figured that in the way that we work through some ideas together, um, I could maybe showcase, just how simple it is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, I
So
was thinking that. Sorry, what were you saying?
well, I was just gonna ask. So that's a good goal. And again, one last thing before we get too into it. What's like the primary contention, I guess, that you want to like disagree with me on, about that?
Hmm.
Like like
Okay,
what?
well, actually, I think. Sorry,
No,
but
just asking. What's the contention? That's it.
well, I was going to say that it really, more than anything, creates blind spots. I'd say because, like, look, I think that your economics,
Mm-hmm.
especially your contemporary economics, really well, and you
Okay.
could absolutely clean my clock. However, I
Okay.
think that you misunderstand the differentiation of reform and revolution.
Okay.
And what I would say is that because of the fact that you seem committed to certain characterizations, I would say that the content of what you're proposing is actually quite revolutionary, especially in the domestic.
Mm-hmm.
Your claim to how it should be done seems to be rooted in reform.
Mm-hmm.
And to be frank with you, while I think that your conversation with Bad Empanada was very flawed in some ways, particularly on his end and his
Mm-hmm.
tone, which was disappointing because I actually think that,
I really
his
like his
takes are quite
content
good.
as far as I could tell, but
Yeah,
him
yeah.
on
It,
Twitter,
it was
him in
just,
debate, not good.
yeah,
Just
he was
not good.
being an ass. But I think that, based on that, you and I might have some disagreements with foreign policy, and this is the place where I'll be harshest. But I would say that it
Mm-hmm.
seemed like in the little I heard, there was the potential for reactionary thought to be
Okay.
implicit in it. And I think that of recent, I've seen a lot of people being socialists or claiming to be socialists and then holding a very reactionary position on certain things. And I think we could sort of talk about that, maybe from the contention of the AOC China, but I'd be happy to do it broadly too.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally,
Okay, so we
I
got four
found the
things.
liberal democracy. I found the liberal democracy.
You found the liberal democracy where socialist revolution won. You found the singular one. Okay.
Well, I think that there's several
I think you mentioned
manifestations, but
three. We had like a little free chat before,
mhm.
but
Yeah, and I think actually in the chaos of that little pre-chat, I realized that there's actually been there is one that I think we can both agree on.
okay.
Um,
So
those
why
other
don't
three I do stand by, but the one I think that you can really make the case for is the German Revolution, which I would
okay.
argue was a social democratic revolution.
So why don't so since this is four topics, right? Why don't we start
Yes,
with one, maybe the first one I
that's
was
what I
going to
was
suggest,
thinking.
which is reform and revolution in a broad sense, right?
Hmm.
Um, so was your characterization that you said that it sounded like I did in fact believe in revolutionary
Hmm.
ideals, or maybe I
I
misunderstood?
was, yeah, you misunderstood me a little bit. I think that your policy, your meat,
Mm-hmm.
actually in fact necessitates
So you think my
revolution in the
goal
American
requires
context.
revolution, right?
Yes.
Okay.
However, I am of the opinion, and this has been largely true of Western revolutions, that revolution does not necessarily imply the armed insurrections that you saw in much of the developing world during the movements of national liberation.
Okay.
And yeah, I think that the content of what you would want to do, and but maybe the best place to start there, right, is if you were to sort of describe, I guess, your program. Perhaps it's the market socialist program. I'm not sure how wedded you are to that term or something like that.
Sure. So I think I would say market socialism is probably the best fit for what I advocate. The I guess basic program would be, in short, it would be something like the creation of a large. What are you doing, cat? Um, in short, it would require like increase in like the reforms of democracy. It would be in terms of like economic stuff. It would be probably like universal cooperative ownership or public ownership. It would be like social wealth fund and a variety of other like state wealth ownership and redistribution
Mm-hmm.
mechanisms,
Wait, can
stuff
I
like that.
just pause 1 second?
Hmm.
And that's kind of like a la Matt Brunig and his sort of, what he talks about with like Norway.
The social wealth fund is, yeah.
Yes.
Um,
Okay. Cool. Yeah. Continue. Sorry.
sure. Yeah. No, like the Norwegian social wealth fund is one example. Yeah, but there's like a general category.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why my cat wants so much attention. Um, so I guess like I guess the broadest scope of this would be I often say socialism has three axes. So it's like I want workplace democracy. So I think to get there you need something like 100% unionization and 100% cooperative owned sort of stuff. Second is something like economic democracy. So for that you need some level of economic planning. Um, and the third
Mm-hmm.
would be
Mm-hmm.
like class compression. So fundamentally, there should be no individual who owns enough capital they could subside off of that capital and not have to leave her. So it's like the creation of, as Marx put it, like the self-abolition of the working class, so that everyone is a worker now. There is no bourgeois left, so everyone's a worker. That would be the fundamental tenets of, I guess, my program. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. Yeah, that would be about it.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Well, I mean, these are fantastic aspirations, like really great. And, I largely agree with all of them. I think that, the aspect of market socialism that I think maybe is most attractive to Americans, or the phrasing of market socialism actually has to do with the fact that, we kind of have a heritage of what you might call market socialism, right? We have our syndicalist movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that's, part of the appeal. So yeah, I agree that 100% cooperative, as the goal is huge. 100% unionization is huge. That
Mm-hmm.
said, right, perhaps these would be, aspirations towards reform. I would say not now in Europe, but perhaps at one time in Europe, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the United
Wake up,
States,
liberal. Hello.
that is a very, very tall order for reform, right? That requires a fundamental change of certain institutions,
Sure.
right? And I think, it's notable, right, when we look at, say, the platforms of, or, what was being put forward by the Paris Commune, right? The undeniable dictatorship of the proletariat. It was a fairly moderate program, right? It certainly wasn't Soviet communism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean,
Um,
this is something I've mentioned. Like, the French Revolution was in some sense a contemporary leftist revolution, and their radical demands were like universal education up to like 3 years of schooling, so you'd get people halfway throughout like elementary school.
Fantastic, which is to say that, like, Germany will be fun with that in mind. But sorry, continue.
Well, I guess so. The fundamental question to me is, so this is my program, right? What in this program do you think can't be achieved by reform? I guess perhaps in this we could also get our terms right. So what do you think revolution implies, and what do you think like reform implies?
Okay, so I believe that revolution implies a fundamental shift in two primary factors.
Mm-hmm.
One is, the terms of class control of governing, right? And I assume you and I probably are in agreement about, the nature, right, of how creating institutions that, facilitate a voice for one group, right, can actually happen in a pretty dynamic range of policy proposals.
You mean like there's various ways to achieve quote unquote worker democracy sort of idea? Is that the
Exactly, yeah.
okay?
And there
Sure.
are different routes to get there.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, and I think that that is something that cannot be facilitated in the context of reform, which I believe is attempting to utilize the current institutions, perhaps adapting them in some capacity, while being simultaneously beholden to those institutions,
Mm-hmm.
but ultimately mediated by representative democracy, at least as it would manifest in, the situations we're talking about.
So I guess the question then is like,
And actually, sorry, could I add one more part?
sure.
Um, I would say that this is more abstract, but I think setting forward a vision of an alteration of capitalism towards a more equitable end, as compared to the progression onto something better, which could very well include a market, and has historically.
Mm-hmm. So
Yeah,
I guess
and I mean, so that's my difference.
well, so then I guess the question that I pose is, if the basic idea is simply that like these would require reforms of the existing institutions to like get to this form of worker democracy. Why, given the enormous amount of like change we've seen in these institutions, do we not think that it would be possible to continue to change them in the direction we desire? Like the analogy that I often point to is the beginning of the American Republic. Just like 0.5% of the voting not the voting population, the total population voted for the U.S. president. Today, it's around 60%. Like the enormous expansion of democracy, both in terms of like people who are able to vote and people who actually like wield power, has just been somewhat unprecedented. So why should we believe that like this is kind of the end point of reform and there we can go no further? Is I guess the fundamental simplest question.
Mhm. So, I think one simple thing might be, you use the example of suffrage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Great point. However, I think one critical difference is the fact that suffrage does not seek to drastically alter the systems by which the economy works, but rather give people access to a process. One is much simpler than the other.
Sure, but I guess one of the ideas in, and I often refer to this, the work of Darren Acemoglu, is that change in process led to changes in outcome. I think that's precisely one of the arguments like for socialism and communism in general. It's that changing the process of economic production towards like worker ownership or communal ownership will itself inevitably change the outcomes of said economy. So I don't think that just saying that it's just doing the one is sufficient to prove that it doesn't also do something else. Is I guess the way I think about these things.
Well, I would say a secondary element that needs to be considered, right, is that in a reform system, you have to contend with an opposition. If I could imagine a beautiful line, right, in which, say a social democratic party could continue the process forward, as, of course, right, was the aspiration of the old social democratic parties, right? I think that, yeah, reform would be great. But at the end of the day, we do know, and we can look to history and see that whenever the chance has come across, shit has been rolled back as hard as, it can, right? Like the NHS, for example, conceptually would be great, right? After underfunding what has happened.
Well, so I guess the problem here is we're kind of working with a sample size of one, if you want to talk about rollbacks. So like the long trend of history from like, I don't know, 1920 to today has been of enormous expansion of these sort of benefits. So like for roughly, like I want to say 60 years or so, there's been a more or less unabated linear expansion of benefits. And then there was a neoliberal period, particularly in the 80s to like 2010s or so, where those benefits were rolled back. But just because, even if we were to say that it genuinely did happen, those benefits were severely curtailed, welfare was severely curtailed, the sample size of one doesn't seem to be sufficient to me to conclude that it will always occur. Particularly when it seems like people are continue to be moving to the left in general on these sorts of issues. Like I know that I cite this example often, but like recently in the United States, are you an American? Not sure.
I'm naturalized, but yeah, I'm American.
Yeah, I was just asking if you live here, rather. Sorry, I'm not like
yeah, I do.
racist question or something. The idea was just like in Florida, which Trump won, obviously. They also passed the $15 minimum wage. There's a lot of evidence that people in America even continue to move left on economic issues, even as they seem to be even as some people in the far right on social issues have been like activated to vote for people like Donald Trump. So I guess the basic premise I'd ask is like, if we see these long trends of history and democratization, what is going to stop them? Just because it happened once, why won't it happen again? And I guess that if I were to extend this, right, of the revolutions we've seen, we kind of have a sample size of one. There was this one big wave of Marxist-Leninist revolutions, and they all kind of died. So if we're willing to say sample size of one, reform doesn't work because of neoliberalism, why can't we say sample size of one, revolution doesn't work because it all fell apart in the 90s? That would be, I guess, the fundamental question.
Well, I mean, so when you say one Marxist, so can you elaborate on what you mean when you say Marx? Also, by the way, I'm not a Marxist-Leninist.
Sure.
And,
I'm just saying, like,
operating. No, and let me just clarify this, right? Because I think that it is a touchy and complex subject, and part of my frustration is I feel like conversations keep going to Stalin. I do not advocate for Stalin.
Okay.
I will not advocate for Stalin.
Good.
And I hope that whoever is watching knows that as well and should keep that in mind. But sorry, what were you saying?
Well, sure. So I was just saying, I'm not trying to paint you as Marxist-Leninist. I'm rather trying to say that the revolutions were Marxist-Leninist. That was the way I was thinking about these things. And so there was this big wave of Marxist-Leninist revolutions from the 20s to the 40s, basically.
Do you mean in the West?
Oh no, like in the East, basically, like Russia, the China. Countries like that, they all revolted.
What about Vietnam?
Was that? I guess that was the 70s. So
yes,
not the 60s.
It was. What about Burkina Faso?
Sure. So the reason you could even say, I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to limit myself temporally. I was saying the main wave was occurring in like the 40s to 60s. It spread to other countries, but then it all collapsed in the 90s. One of the funniest things is like you can look at the names of ruling parties that used to consider themselves communist, and virtually all of them in the year 1990 changed themselves from the Communist Party to a Social Democratic Party. Because the Soviet Union collapsed.
Like Angola.
Yeah.
And, like, of course, in, say, Germany, right, with the Party of Democratic Socialism. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Right? Well, so here's my feeling about Marxist-Leninism, right? It is a little anachronistic when Westerners sort of advocate for Marxist-Leninism, or Marxism-Leninism rather, sorry, domestically, right? One of the best definitions, if I could just read it out, actually, I've heard
Mm-hmm.
of ML, right, is, as follows. Stalinism, historically, was the crystallized ideological expression of a modernization movement in backwards countries where bourgeois democratic revolutions had not taken place.
Mm-hmm.
Stalinism, in the case of Russia specifically, meant the mass proletarianization of Soviet society. The state led this transformation, as regular market forces could not be relied on to enact this rapid industrialization, which had become the imperative for the survival of the Soviet state.
Mm-hmm.
Stalinism became the ideological veneer of capitalist development by other means. I would develop it further and say that in the case of the developing world, it proved itself to be quite potently successful, oftentimes in the cultivation of a national identity,
Mm-hmm.
and along with that, a means of entering the world system without too much chaos. That said, when we look at the outcomes of some of them, they are undeniably failures. If you look
Mm-hmm.
at Romania, or you say, you see a totalitarian disaster. When you look at China, you see a revisionism to the point of capitalism. However, I think when you look at certain examples of Marxist-Leninists in
Mm-hmm.
slightly different contexts, I think the two strongest examples are Vietnam, which is certainly a mixed economy, but one of the things I do want to stress is that the essence of socialism does not exclude a market immediately. Um, and as another one, right, and this is a fully democratic process. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, it did much of what a social democracy would sort of support to do would be my home state of Kerala, where the Communist Party of India, Marxist,
Mm-hmm.
spearheaded a far greater degree of human development than the Congress was capable of doing in the same time period.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I
So, which
guess.
is to say that like it's not really that relevant to Western countries at the end of the day because it is the product of a developing country realizing that they weren't going to get support from the West in Germany, and I'd love to get to that soon.
Well, sure. So I fundamentally agree. This is one of the things that I argue that not only Marxism-Leninism, but that like revolutionary ideologies also seem to be anachronistic. They seem to be somewhat out of line with history, because I guess the general argument is the rate of revolution in general has seriously declined over time, and the rate of success of revolution has also seriously declined over time. And I think the simplest explanation for this is that modern states have gotten stronger, and modern people have gotten like better fed, better educated, higher income, and so they have less reason to revolt. Like high income, highly fed people have a lot more on the line than do the like classic starving Russian peasants, starving Russian like industrialists, starving Chinese peasants, sort of that spearheaded the respective revolutions there. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that's
I
I
guess
guess I would
is
extend
that
this logic
true?
just a little bit further. I
I
mean,
don't
if
know
you
if that's fully true. I
which
think
part, the like
that
historical note or the like trend note, I guess.
I guess for me, I think for one,
Mm-hmm.
I think appreciating certain things. And let's specify. Let's talk about if we're talking about a domestic situation. Let's not think about the West broadly. Let's think about America specifically. Because do I think that some of these things would be viable in Europe via reform? Absolutely. In America, I'm not so sure.
What do you think it
Um,
would be so special about the United States that would? Well, no, let's not get into that. Let's finish up the Marxism-Leninism thing.
right. Could you remind me of where we were?
Sure. So I was just asking, like, I was saying that Marxism-Leninism is anachronistic. I agree, but I also was saying I'm asserting that revolutionary theories in general I think are somewhat anachronistic or out of context,
Hmm.
because I think that they presuppose a much weaker state, a state that is much easier to overthrow, and a people that is much more willing to revolt. I think that you aren't going to get that unless you genuinely succeed in acting some sort of like hyper accelerationism, which doesn't seem to be feasible. So I think that we aren't really going to return to that unless there's like some sort of
Yeah.
ecological catastrophe, at which point socialism is probably shot anyway. So,
Yeah, I think that, you on one level you understand that revolution is not armed insurrection,
mm-hmm,
although it may include in the West very small scale examples of that.
mm-hmm,
But rather it refers to a mere overturning of a previous system, not getting rid of the national spirit of it, not getting rid of base principles, right? For example, I could imagine that the Bill of Rights certainly would need to be retained and institutionalized, However, what I think makes America very special, right, is you've said that you don't think dual power is super viable in the States, if I remember correctly,
Dual
right?
power. I mean, I would say that mostly for like temporary reasons. I don't think it's like a structural thing. Like
Mm-hmm.
if we are to speak of Europe, right, until the 70s, Spain, Portugal, and Greece were de facto fascist dictatorship. So too
Yeah.
was Spain. So too was South Korea and Taiwan. Today, these countries in the past 20, 30 years have enormously shifted towards democracy. Enormously. They're often now led by center-left coalitions. Much
You
like the
realize that
analogy would
Portugal
be
had a
Chile.
revolution, right?
So this is one of those things where I was going to get into that terminology. That was the kind of, sort
Okay,
of
so
second
now
thing.
you're not going to count the Carnation Revolution, and like this
Mm-mm,
seems a little
mm-mm. So,
opportunistic.
so, so I was trying to say, I think of these things as a gradient. I think generally when people are trying to defend revolution, they aren't trying to defend, like, to me, it seems duplicitous. Not duplicitous. I don't want to imply intent. I think that there's equivocation between the meaning of revolution in like Marxist-Leninism, which is clearly about organizing people and like a sort of violent revolution. Like that's why the Maoists talk about people's war, and revolution, which in the very broad sense just means like big radical change of government, which is like something that Bernie Sanders can get behind.
Hmm.
I'm totally okay with dual power and mass strikes and like trying to force the government to change their hands. I think Mao the Infidel talked to me a little bit about this recently. A whole bunch of unions in Norway recently forced their prime minister to resign because he wanted to cut like postal workers' pensions or something. I'm like, that's good, that's fine. That's a technical, on a small level, government change. The question is more about how extreme it can be and what methods it can use. And I think generally the opposition between me and others tends to be whether they're willing to use violence and whether they're willing to organize towards violence, whether they're willing to participate in like electoralism in general. Those tend to be the
Um,
main differences.
okay, I mean, I think it's a little ungenerous to locate Marxism, Leninism as like the holy site of revolution,
I'm
right?
not
In
trying to do
Cuba,
that.
for
I
example,
would
it
say
was
that
not
anarchist ones similar
Marxist-Leninist
had.
until
I would just say that similar other theories of revolution have similar failures. Um,
I mean, the Spanish Revolution was not specifically violent. Um, you know, the French
sure.
Revolution historically was, but
Hmm.
and what we're going to talk about, I would not call the German Revolution an explicitly violent revolution, but it actually yielded one of the most successful states in Europe.
So I guess the idea here is that violence exists on a spectrum, and so the advocacy that I'm pushing for is that we should want in general to highly limit violence. That's the thesis that I'm advocating for. Where it seems like many revolutionaries do not wish to limit violence; they wish to use violence because they believe that it is generally useful. And I think that's like the difference here is about like not only how much do we advocate violence, but how useful do we think it is. Um,
Mhm.
but
Yeah, I mean, I've gotten I've gotten beaten the shit out of for struggling for reforms,
mhm.
and people have been killed on account of it too. I think if you look at it, I would argue that considering the push for reforms has been largely broader, you will probably see more people who were killed on account of a reformist position than a revolutionary one, especially in America and the West.
Maybe that seemed like the Russian Civil War alone. I believe involved like 10 million deaths. While possible, I'm not sure.
Why are you
But
talking about that was a that was a semi-feudal country, maybe more accurately, but it was
well,
it's they had illiterate people,
I mean,
right? That's huge in itself.
sure. I mean, if we want to talk
They
about
had people starving, as you said. The material conditions, might have merited it, right? So clearly, it's a very different example, even from Western Europe back in 1918.
well, no, I wasn't trying to say like there's some objectivity about like that. This has any implication for the future. It was just like historically, if we tally up the dead, I'm genuinely not sure about this. I wasn't trying to like. I don't think it's very relevant to either of our arguments whether it's true that more died one way or the other. So that's not
Um,
a big push.
I think that almost every third world struggle for independence
Mm-hmm.
has been filled to the brim with violence.
Sure.
It is a sad truth, right? And that is part of what makes, these figures so remarkable, right? That in spite of the fact that they were facing an outsized power in their push for, and let's be clear, I think it was just self determination, right?
Mm-hmm.
In their struggle for self determination, they had to face an enemy very ready to use violence.
Mm-hmm.
And use violence they did. However, when you look at the cases of attempted revolution, both successful and foiled, there has not been that much violence. Like, it's just true.
How would you argue this?
Hmm?
Like,
Go look up the death count of the 1918-1919 German Revolution.
I sure. Wikipedia says doesn't give a number.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm. Well, I can tell you that at least in the sort of in the most famous event from that time,
mm-hmm.
um, which is probably at the very end, right? And I think the reason why people often don't think about this as a revolution is, of course, because of the foiled communists at the very end.
Mm-hmm.
But in that, at least, there were, I believe,
Sure.
77 people killed by, in the Freikorps, the fascists, and police forces, and there were about, I think, like 1,000 killed of the workers, right? So
So
it is hard, right? People do die, but at the same time, I think that it is not a question of spontaneously pushing for it, right? But it is a question of acknowledging that there does reach a certain point where people are ready to do it.
So the problem with using this as an example is that like the scope of the Spartacist revolution was relatively limited.
It was not a Spartacist revolution, it was a social democratic revolution,
Well, no, no.
which
So
we'll talk about.
the original social democratic one was like the whole country. But I'm saying like specifically. So I think that this is partly getting, and maybe we could just directly skip to this point. One of the talking points that I often say is there have been no successful socialist revolutions in a liberal democracy. Um, and I think this was an example you pointed to, but we could change talking about this if you wanted to talk about another one. Um,
I
like,
think that, and so this is a great example of, I think, a place where
because
I
I
think
guess what
talking about dialectics is really great.
so I guess
Um,
the problem that I'm having here
mhm.
is if the argument is that to achieve socialism we need revolution, and then the examples of successful revolution you can point to aren't socialist, and they don't achieve that goal, then I don't think this makes a very compelling argument that revolution is a good way to achieve that goal. If that makes any
um,
sense, right? The Social
you don't
Democrats
think that
neither did not achieve the socialist goal. They did not achieve the things that I'm talking about. They did not achieve the things that you're talking about when you mean socialism. So to say that like they needed revolution to get there, it doesn't seem like that's a very compelling argument because they didn't.
I would I would say that in terms of what their intentions and their vision was, yes, absolutely it did work. And don't forget, right, that just like 25, 30 years prior, this was the party of Engels. And what was still true then was that this was the flagship party of the Second International.
Mm-hmm.
Rosa Luxemburg was in the Social Democratic Party, or the Independent Social Democratic Party, which of
Mm-hmm.
course was a formation that we can talk about in a bit, but still aligning with the Social Democrats. The Communist Party of Germany, right, came at the very, very end. But the revolution was initially kickstarted, which culminated in the overthrow of the monarchy, which did give greater access. It came with supervision of the state through a semi presidential system
Mm-hmm.
in the way of Ebert coming into the presidency. It granted the basic social reforms that, the humanistic social democrats understood as basic rights,
Mm-hmm.
i.e., universal suffrage immediately. And
Sure.
they provided, radical freedom of speech to the point that, after suppressing the KPD violently, they let them keep existing.
Mm-hmm. Well, so
And at the end of the day, we still see among the large countries, one of the countries with some of the most robust protections, period. But along with that, some of the most effective guarantees to collective bargaining. And they also are notable, right? I used to actually have a joke with a French friend of mine in college. We'd say Bernie Sanders is our favorite Christian Democrat,
mm-hmm.
right? And I think it says something, right? That in that country, even the center right, right, they will never cross the line that, say, the conservatives in Britain have, right? Or even for
I,
that matter,
I'm just not sure that this is the
conservatives in
greatest
France.
example. So like there are multiple axes here, and Germany's healthcare system is a multi-payer system, right? It is not even single payer. If we wanted to look at like the UK and the Nordics, we could say, hey, those are single payer systems. Which one is more
Mm-hmm.
socialist? Um, So I'm not sure that just saying, hey, there's co-determination in Germany, which there is a very good argument, because there's also co-determination in France and Switzerland and Denmark. Um, I guess I'm just not sure that pointing to this revolution is a very strong argument when we see these sorts of things in similar, less revolutionary countries. That's the analogy there.
Yes, but now you're cordoning off something that, is, I think, I guess, attempting to ossify what the meaning of things that exist in motion are, if
Mm-hmm.
that makes sense. Right? You're saying that, here are the preconditions for a socialist revolution in itself. Setting them, I think it's notable that you bring up single payer healthcare, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
that isn't a paradigm that they could even think about at that point. On the other hand, right,
Well,
you
no.
can hear
I was
at
just
the
saying
same
that it's
time.
like if the argument is that the revolution strengthened the German leftist politics, it doesn't seem like that's like borne out in more leftist policies 50 years down the line than comparable non-revolutionary countries. That's why I pointed to Denmark and France,
Wake up,
Switzerland,
liberal.
not Switzerland,
Hello?
No
Sweden.
country of its scale, however, and this is especially impressive considering how frequently it's run by conservatives, has been able to retain as much power for labor as them. Do I think that I actually would argue that it is a failure of it, and I think that the revolution was ultimately a failure. But to say that they didn't create institutions through an overturning of the system, beginning with popular support, including the radical left,
Mm-hmm.
and then leading to the production of a state that retained many of the institutions that they fought for, right? And perhaps the historical social democratic vision failed, but frankly, the social democrats also failed. They were already shifting pretty far right, and I think that that is a fair point you make. But they only shifted further, right? At the end of the day, right, in the same way that you can say, has there been a, liberal democracy, right,
Mm-hmm.
that has, ever had a revolution? I think the counterpoint to that, right, the other side of it, is has there been a democracy where a electoralist reformist party has been able to take power and keep
So
from
there's
either
a different
shifting
burden
life
being put
right?
here.
Can I finish? Can I finish
Sure.
quickly, just so I can give you the definition?
Mm-hmm.
That either shifted right internally, or had to deal with an opposition that was belligerent and ended up rolling back quite a lot of it. Now, keep in mind, right, how far do you go is entirely dictated by what they had gained in the first place. We're always trying to push towards socialism, are we not?
Sure. So what I would put here, what I would put forward here is that we have to use comparable terms here. So the reformist to gain power is merely suggesting that you gain electoral power basically, and the reformist explicitly acknowledges that what they promise is not like socialist, quick reform into socialism. So the burden, on the other hand, for the revolutionary is usually the assertion that you can use the revolution to radically adopt leftist tactics.
Okay. Yeah, I think that there's a bit of a misunderstanding, right? I think you're trying to frame communism in the same paradigms as anarchism, right? And I would say my biggest critique of anarchism is that they spend too much time fantasizing about the world to come rather than thinking about how that world might be built and the process of building that world at every step of the process. And understanding where have we gone? What progress have we made? What reaction have we had? I'm not opposed to a struggle for reforms. I, however, do not think that you can make that the basis of a socialist politic because of the fact that inevitably you reach a point where your demands will be refused.
So that's the fundamental question that I'm trying to get at. So when the reformist says, hey, we look at these trends, we look at increasing democratization, we look at increasing education, it seems like societies keep moving left and left in the broad sense, long term, with like a notable rollback in the 1980 to 2010 period, especially. The question is fundamentally, what will change that? What will stop the long-term drift? Where the revolutionary needs to argue that even though there hasn't been a revolution that's been successful and the trends are against revolution, the reformers can say that there have been reforms that's been successful and the trends are in general in favor of reform. That's the difference there, I think. It's both a trend argument and we've seen some of it argument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess, the point I'm trying to make, right, is that, you know, your differentiation um, is just actually based on a misunderstanding of the history of revolution in the world. At the end of the day, 100 years really isn't that long a time in the scope of human history. Is it harder? Yes, absolutely. Had capitalism reached a point of maturity where this could be an issue? Um, Probably not, right? And that is why you saw things fall flat on their face. However, I think at the end of the day, and you actually have this quote, it opens Reform or Revolution by Rosa Luxemburg, where it talks about how, the struggle for reform and revolution is one and the other, one of the other. So I
Mm-hmm.
guess, at this point, maybe the trouble with difference as a definition is because of the fact that one of the big things I'd like to get a better sense of is why you insist on saying, I am not this, I am this.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the thing, right? Is that, when you are looking at things dialectically, you have to recognize, that reconciling these contradictions and the validity in both of them, right, is how you arrive somewhere. And that's how she comes to her conclusion about the social democratic argument, right? Which then was struggle for reforms now, but always have the revolution at the back of your mind. That was the social democratic position once upon a time. And
So
I don't see why you are moving to the right of that. As a matter of fact, I
sure,
have
the
local
argument there
politicians
is
in
all
my
about
area in the DSA who are to the left on you, to the left of you on this issue, like
sh-
elected officials.
sure, because I think that fundamentally the argument here is about efficacy. It's does pushing for revolution. Um, there's two approaches to this. One is a very simple optical appeal. It's that, hey, when we push for revolution, we come off as having bad optics. It makes people disassociate with our movement. It also might make people take violent actions, which also make people disassociate with our movement. So that's just like the pragmatic argument. Then there's the outcomes argument. It's that, hey, if we had the power to push for revolution, should we do it? And so the problem with this is the reason I often cite the work of like Chenoweth and Stefan is because it shows two things. First is that mass resistance. So let's assume that we had the power in terms of like dual power, not power in terms of political power. We had the power in terms of like, I don't know, the SRA got really, really beefy and now it's got so many guns that it could like fight the government, right? The question is, if we could win the revolution,
You're
would
falling back on the armed insurrection thing. I keep saying that, historically Western revolutions have not taken the form of these protracted armed insurrections.
sure?
But
So then, what form would it
I
take?
promise, huh?
Sure. Then, what
What would
form would
it
it
be?
take? Yeah.
It would be a new structure of governance.
Well, but if that's literally it, then like that seems to be something that reformists could also like accommodate. Like if you're literally
Yeah,
just saying like, hey, we have enough people power that we will do like like we will call another constitutional convention and we'll write up the USSA constitution or something. Sure, but usually the advocacy, and this is the reason, like when you talk to people about the revolution, they're usually this is often an argument people will raise for say gun ownership. Well, why do they need gun ownership if it's just a change of government? Um,
Mhm.
that's the sort of, I guess that's fundamentally the way I'm thinking about this. Are they just using
Mhm.
the guns to scare people? Is it just a threat? Are they not actually going to use them? I don't know.
Mhm. So I mean, I think that your perspective on these things is a little bit online.
Okay.
To be frank, I don't mean that, in like any negative way, but it does sound a little online,
Okay.
you know? I think that when people talk to me about revolution in the world, it usually takes not the form of saying we need a revolution, but it takes the form of people saying we need something better. We need something better than the structures that the American government takes right now. And they can be reformed and we should push to get our basic human rights because that is what we are still operating on. You can talk about this leftward shift, but at the end of the day, right, there are plenty of people in America who still have open sewage. I don't know if you've spent some time in, places like Skid Row in LA, but I can tell you as someone who is from the developing world, it is
Mm-hmm.
absolutely on par. Another thing I will say is that frankly, people who have been living here since the 2000s, immigrants from the developing world, have
Mm-hmm.
explicitly told me more and more this is really beginning to resemble what we came from, right? So to say that things are, naturally progressing in a positive direction, I mean, come on, you probably don't like Steven Pinker, do you? You sound like Steven Pinker.
I think that the argument that like, I think that it's easy to appeal to the idea that like poverty is massively increasing and so on, but this is just not the case. I
Hmm? it's not so much a question, right, of poverty per se increasing. It is a question of, I think, a few factors, of which poverty is one of them. One
Mm-hmm.
is economic precarity. Another is inequity increasing, which
Sure.
even in just constructing a psyche has a tremendous effect, right? And another, frankly, is a sense of agency, a sense of enfranchisement. It is overcoming alienation. It is, and alienation, of course, is not even necessarily a psychic state. It is the process by which you are made into an object, essentially, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it is people, and this is the part that I think really needs to sort of be touched on, because these Marxist-Leninists on the internet, they are allergic to the philosophy that is the underpinning of texts like Capital and stuff, right? And it is unfortunate that some of it is complex, but I will be recommending several things that touch on it that are 2 pages long.
Okay.
So it is viable. At the end of the day, right, you're continuing. So actually, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought a little. You
Well,
know where we're
so
at,
I
right?
guess the thing that I'm trying to point to is there are some trends which are starkly bad in the United States, but there are other trends which are starkly positive. Again, the long-term trend is like that there's been this enormous expansion of the welfare state. There's been a retrenchment since the 90s, in particular, in the United States of the welfare state. But if anything, it seems like even Joe Biden is willing to expand it out, right? So if the argument is, hey, in Germany, the centrists are willing to expand the welfare state, it seems like if you read all the stuff about Biden's welfare plan, it's going to expand the welfare state. Seems like you might
Yeah,
get something like a public option. Seems like you might get like community college free.
sure. So I'll say that I've been very impressed by a lot of what Biden's put forward. And again, like if someone wants to vote, that's
Yeah, it's
fine.
clearly
But
Kamala
I think
speaking
that
like Marxist
frankly
whispers into his
that,
ears.
yeah, thanks, Dad.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, I think that I've been impressed. It has definitely been to the left, and I think I'm very happy that that is the case. I would say that that is because of external agitation, though, in part, and the efforts of remarkable, inspiring figures like Bernie Sanders, who I actually think would kind of agree with me. Um,
Well, so the
and
but Sanders.
however,
Mm-hmm.
can I just finish one last piece about this?
Sure.
My personal feeling is time after time, we've seen very exciting platforms.
Mm-hmm.
I myself can say cool, but I will not assess whether that is the true direction that things will go in until we start seeing some governance. So I'm just going to withhold my judgment. Do I think that the Democrats are in a great position to like finally get some reforms we sorely need? Absolutely.
Sure. So I guess the way that I'm thinking about this is so fundamentally the reason I point to these long-term trends is have you ever heard of like the gravedigger thesis?
No. Could you tell me about it?
Sure. So like it's basically usually it's contrasted to the so-called collapse thesis, which is that capitalism will collapse. You usually find that in like say the writings of Luxemburg. She argued that there would be an overaccumulation problem and that capitalism would
Right.
eventually just collapse. And this was clearly untrue, or at least if it's true, it doesn't I don't know it doesn't seem to be showing up in any of the trends that I can observe. So the way that I think about these things is mostly through the so-called gravedigger thesis, which is that if anything, it seems like capitalism is getting more stable. But one of the reasons it's getting more stable is it's educating more workers, it's integrating supply lines, it's like centralizing economic control. And so the theory is that capitalism is digging its own grave by educating workers, organizing them, giving them the tools by which to like oppose capitalist power in essence. Um,
Well, Marx came up with that idea originally. That's kind of like the basis of like Marx's historical progression.
So that could be.
I
It's
can,
just that Marx
yes,
specifically
it
advocates
is.
for revolution, right? So the question is then, and so like how do I put this? I know that we seem to disagree on the meaning of revolution semantically, but like when Karl Marx says revolution, he wants like the abolition of markets. He wants like he's talking about like 1848. He's talking about like the French communes.
Hmm.
It seems very hard to if we want to
Hmm.
appeal to Marx to say that he's thinking about like revolution as just like the way that Sanders is thinking about it, which is just like a big shift of power or something.
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
Actually, maybe Marx isn't even the best person to talk, turn to about that, but rather Lenin. If I could give a quote from State and Revolution.
Okay.
A witty German social democrat of the 70s of the last century, called the Postal Service an example of the socialist economic system.
Was it
This is
Schenk-Uger?
very true. I know, right? I know. This is very true. The Postal Service is a business organized on the lines of state capitalist monopoly. Imperialism is gradually transforming all trusts into organizations of a similar type, in which, standing over the common people, who are overworked and starved, one has the same bourgeois bureaucracy. But the mechanism of social management is here already to hand. Once we have overthrown the capitalists, crushed the resistance of these exploiters with the iron hand of the armed workers, we're talking about Russia, and smash the bureaucratic machinery of the modern state, we shall have a splendidly equipped mechanism, freed from the parasite. Right? And the second part, it sounds a whole lot to me like that 2019, the People's Republic of Walmart, and the basic thesis of that.
Sure.
Right? And so what I mean to say, right, is that, are you talking about the Communist Manifesto?
Well, I guess...
The thing is, Marx actually doesn't really, when you look at the whole picture, right, make it super clear what he envisions. However, there is one that at the very end, right, that is because it is not so much a question of what communism is going to be, but how do we build socialism, right? And when you look at what Marxists in the wake have said in the West, Rosa Luxemburg being the best example, she was ardently pro-revolutionary. Do you think that she was advocating for armed insurrection in the way that Lenin was?
Well, I mean, she did participate in one.
That insurrection, I mean, come on. Like, if that's really what we're saying in terms of armed insurrection, I mean,
well, but
that is going to happen in a reforms, movement as well, huh?
I don't, not necessarily.
It's failed because of the fact that they kind of you realize that the Communist Party of Germany was founded something like a week or 2 weeks before they were killed.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is...
It was a microscopic organization. They really had no, aspiration, and it was until that moment that she kept calling herself a social democrat.
Sure,
and
but just because, social democracy then has a different meaning than today. The basic way that I think about these things is that, she was part of the more revolutionary wing of the social democratic movement. And so I'm not trying to paint these people as revolutionaries. I don't think that's a very useful discussion. The discussion is more to me about the fundamentals of how we get there. And so if you're willing to say these armed insurrections are part of the movement, I'm not sure I can agree that that's a useful method to get there. Because from what I read, it seems like these sorts of things tend to turn people away from the movement, not help them.
So I think you're right. Movement is everything, right? Movement,
well, glad we agree that Bernstein and Mason never got anything wrong.
Funny. That is funny, actually.
Wake up, liberal.
But, I think you're right that movement is everything. And with movement in mind, I guess, could you describe to me the process by which we will cooperatize the American economy in full through reform? Give me your plan. Give me, your however many year plan.
I mean, I guess the basic ideas would be...
I love you.
Damn it, did I run out of power? Oh, I'm seething. Oh, sure. So the fundamental thesis would be gain electoral power, pass laws. That's the core of it. How do we get there? Well, the answers are electoral reforms. You want to increase the power of the House. You want to make the U.S. institutions more democratic. You want to run left-wing entryism in the Democratic Party, then eventually reform that so that you can run outside the Democratic Party. And then once you do so, you'd do stuff like the examples would be to point to stuff like the Meidner Plan, or even Sanders proposed various policies in this respect. So you'd do something like, hey, if your firm is over this size, then you have to give establish a union. You have to give a certain amount of stocks per year to said union. That's the sort of stuff that I think we're talking about.
It's still not at 100% cooperatization, mind you.
Well, sure, that's more of the short-term stuff.
Okay, well then, the thing is, then I don't even think you should be advocating for 100% cooperatization. I think if you want to commit yourself to the struggle for reforms, which is productive, it takes all sorts, you really can't be talking about aspirations because of the fact that you can't get me to 100% cooperatization through reforms right now. Do you want to keep? We can keep going if you'd like, but I want to start actually from the very first step.
Saying that you can't
Okay,
get to
so
something
now we have
immediately isn't the same thing as that you can't get there in general, right? Like the
no, but I think that you can sort of show me broadly how we can continue because we're not even close yet. We're still in Germany, literally.
sure. So like the suggestion is then now that you've gotten to like something like Germany that you'd
But
go.
actually, hold on. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
Mhm.
I want to go back because I think
Okay.
that an important part of this, right, is when we assess a process, we must assess the totality, right? And I think we need to look at some of the earlier steps before we go to that second half.
Hmm.
And I think it's as simple as first looking at electoral reform. There are certain
Hmm.
things that can absolutely be reformed. Do I think that campaign finance reform is happening very soon through reform? Definitely.
Okay.
Definitely, definitely, definitely. On the other hand, I mean, giving more power to the House of Representatives, that will, for one, the right wing has already run a series of talking points that have started prepping right wingers to believe that this is a republic and not a democracy,
Hmm.
right? And the second that you see pushing for for more power in the House of Representatives, I have a feeling that you are going to see an uproar, an absolute uproar, and frankly, you could even see a potential insurrection from right wingers again,
Hmm.
right? And now we're at step one. And now, ironically, right, because of such a large scale insurrection, theoretically, you're
Hmm.
already forced into a revolutionary period defensively.
So I'm just not sure. So I think that there is so like the house stuff I think is further off, but that's like one of the basic ideas of making the United States more democratic. Like it's to extend like the sort of gravedigger thesis, it's that as we've seen increases of democracy, we've generally seen concomitant increases of like worker power. And so, as the United States gets more democratic, it generally enables more left-wing movements. So, like to put a number on it, in the United States, the Democrats are about 5 points disadvantaged by gerrymandering, and the Senate there's something like 3 points different disadvantaged by gerrymandering. So leftists need to be about 3% more of the population than they would need to be in a comparable country. If we imagine
Do you
the
think that
Democrats are
this is the
leftists.
most left-wing moment we've had in American history?
Probably not. No, that would be like the 20s to 30s.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think to say that, we can move a bit further, and and look,
Well,
um,
but I don't
I
know what
don't
that has
think
to do
that
with
there should
the
be a
point here.
revolution tomorrow, by any means. By any means.
Like I
I
guess
think that
the
there
the
should
very thing that I would point to, right, is that like in FDR's time, right, there were enormous
there are
economic changes
communists.
done. There were
And there
communists
were communists
agitating.
who were
Yes, and there were
consulting. Yeah.
communists agitating, right? And that led to these reforms. But there wasn't like there was people will point to like the business plot and stuff like that. There was no serious like way to remove, say, Roosevelt from power. This sort of like wide scale insurrection just doesn't seem to occur. Again, to appeal to Asa Moglu, one of the very countries that he points to, he has this idea of what he calls like a balanced path of growth of like social of like civil society and public basically government power and societal power. And the example he points to is literally Sweden as being one of the most stable transition paths, because of the like various like things that the Social Democrats went through in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So I think that saying that these sort of reforms will come with instability doesn't seem to be that reasonable. The biggest thing that seemed to cause
I
instability in the United States are race stuff. It's not about economic stuff.
I think that the journey to get there will be a very fraught process. I think it will be a very fraught process, and I think that you are, to some extent, overestimating things. Because at the end of the day, what we are talking about when we are talking about these, the change from a, bicameral Congress where
Mm-hmm.
both sides have power, right? And part of it is loaded explicitly, and it's still taught this way, and it's still taught in a vaguely good way, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's small. It is there to enfranchise small states. I think it's very. I think it's going to be read as a cultural issue, and I think that people have a remarkable capacity to bring all roads back to the culture war, and this is true of both liberals and conservatives in America.
Well, sure. I guess the so how do I put this? Well, have you, one of the book recs that I constantly do, right? So here's my read theory moment, right? Have you had a chance to read the book Politics is for Power?
I have read the article on The Atlantic after your recommendation, and
Okay.
I agree with elements of what he is concerned with. I think, for example, concerning yourself primarily with like local action is generally the path to go in. I think one of the most impressive feats I've ever seen was when I was living in Portland, Oregon, and I saw how a number of my friends successfully started one of the first fast food unions in America.
Mm-hmm.
The process to get there, though, is like very slow and it's very challenging, right? And it would require an overturn of legislation. So it continues to be a minority union. You know, they're continuing to get squished, right? Like, I just don't know when you're going to get that kind of reform.
So the reason I was pointing to it was actually not the community reform.
Especially
stuff.
when you have the cultural issues that need to be waded through first to even get to a place where you have enough power to enact reform.
So the reason I was pointing to Hirsch was not actually anything to do with the community aspects, which, you know, they're great and I love them. It was entirely to do with a related point that they talked about like the long-term trends of why certain things have occurred in like American politics. So the reason that I was bringing this up is like we've seen a decline of the left in the West since the 80s. And one of the big theses of Hirsch is that this is fundamentally due to the decline, and this is a thesis that's also shared by a guy that I constantly recommend called David Shore, decline of economic salience and rise of social salience. Basically meaning that if an economic issue is salient to you, then you think about it, you vote for candidates based on it, and you shape your opinions based on it. So social issues are what most Americans vote on. It's gay marriage, it's immigration, it's race. And so on some, Democrats are very popular, and on others, they are not. And so all told, the social issues comes to maybe like a 55% in favor of Democrats or something along those lines. But on economic issues, the Democrats are something like 70% support. It's just unambiguously a Democratic landslide. And a classic rule of thumb in U.S. Electoral stuff is take the margin of victory, multiply it by 2, and that's roughly your House margin of victory.
Yes.
And so a 70% win in the House popular vote would be equivalent to about a 90% control of the chamber. So obviously that's not what the situation looks like. It's one where Democrats cling on barely. So I guess the reason I brought it up is just like to point to one of the reasons why reforms will roll back. It's in part actually due to that culture war stuff you're talking about. The evangelicals got awoken in United States politics. They started caring about abortion, and they started voting right. Basically the racists got awoken about race issues and they started voting right.
Well, what's interesting is their initial enfranchisement, of course, was like brought by Carter, but then almost immediately shifts dramatically rightward.
Yeah. So I guess the reason I'm just bringing this up is like there were different in every country on earth. There was a sort of neoliberal wave, and some of that has to do with the economic crisis of the 70s and the 80s, which often led to inflation. And inflation was seen as something that the left wing couldn't handle, so the right wing like came in and was better able to deal with it, allegedly, due to like the oil shock and a whole bunch of related crises. So that's a whole bundle of history. But the reason I bring this all up is just like I agree with you that people currently think about things very socially, but I think one of the reasons that the left has been ascendant in the United States is because people are putting more saliency on economic issues, and those are very popular. So that's the basic take there. In short, the take is that like when the left wins in part by putting more saliency on economic issues.
Yeah. So I think that a place where, well, actually, I think I need, a clarification. Do you think I'm advocating for like revolution tomorrow?
No.
Do you think I'm advocating for revolution in 6 months?
No. We don't need to keep doing this. Like, I think that you're probably advocating for revolution in like some sort of midterm future after like an organization of some kind.
I mean, I think that there are certain things that we cannot anticipate the direction it will go in, right? But I think that things like the oncoming climate crisis and automation, specifically, will reach a point that they have not reached yet that will be a bit of a breaking point. They just will, right? And there will have to be a huge reckoning, right, with the way that we organize society. That is like my sense of it, right? And it's not like automation of that extent is happening tomorrow. However, I think that the priority right now is not to, well, I think it is on the electoral front. It is to get people in a place where they've hit a critical mass and can form a third party. Interestingly enough, what you could argue is that actually the DSA, in a sense, has taken a dual power approach.
Well, I guess so. The way that I would put this is it has not. So dual power, in my understanding, especially, so like dual power specifically means like outside of conventional routes to power. So like usually the term I've seen used is something like extra legal. So it's like the Bolsheviks were not just like another party; they were like they were a party outside of the classic electoral process. The DSA instead is doing what I would call entryism, more akin to the Fabians in British labor history. And so I guess I'm suggesting that this too is an effective strategy. It's that like voting for Dems, broadly speaking, voting for electoral reform, broadly speaking, are the best ways to get your third party.
Well, that's the only way to get your third party.
Basically.
Right? It's a third party. Of course, but again, I think you're noticing hopefully right now that I'm saying I'm not opposed to people running. My big philosophy, right, is that, however, as socialists, we should be concerning ourselves with things like the fact that there is no labor movement, right? Speaking of your 100% unionization, right? That is actually in some ways a much more immediate goal than cooperatization, since it doesn't entail.
Well, that's why when you ask me like what is the goal,
property.
Well, I was just saying that's like when you ask me what the goal is, you need to like build social democracy in America before you can build socialism. It's not like if you were in Europe, maybe you could talk about doing the stuff that like Corbyn was talking about, where you just like start giving the unions like control of firms. You can't even do that in the United States. So sure.
That's exactly what I'm saying, and I mean, that's the kind of thing, right? Especially when it's tied alongside, things like right to work, right? That mean that reform for that will be a very difficult process. However, right? So for me, considering that I am not like super preoccupied as a socialist with electoral stuff, I will say, however, that, there are politicians who I find inspiring, right? Who operating as a citizen, who wants further human rights for my fellow citizens. I diverge from many socialists and say, I'll vote. But my issue is when people who sort of call themselves a socialist and understand it centrally do not recognize how much of a paradigm shift, not only in economics, but also in just culture, right? Because that's the other thing, right? Marxism is also a theory of culture, and people try to run away from it, but that is one of the greatest failures of actually existing socialism.
So I guess, let me put it to you like this. So I guess I'm trying to figure out where exactly we disagree. Actually, so let me put it in two ways. First, would you agree with this statement? Like, I don't know what ideology you'd align with, but ideology you align with in the sheets, Dems, like Soc Dem in the streets, that you'll vote Soc Dem. In practice, you're going to be acting as a Soc Dem. But even if you have an ideology underneath it, that generally doesn't come out. Is that the take, or?
It means I will be a communist in both the sheets and the streets.
Sure. How would your everyday activism be different than like a Soc Dem?
Well, for one, I think that an emphasis of the fact that there is a problem in culture would be a major concern. That there are just issues with the human psyche right now that are deeply broken, right? At the end of the day, so much of what informs social relations right now, and if we're speaking especially about the online sphere, it's envy and resentment. Right? To some extent, me conveying those two things to you is what, prompted you to like take a second look at what I was saying, right? These are issues, right? Sure. And frankly, I mean, that is just as much an element of class consciousness as well, right? Well, so for me, I think that the concerns enter the realm of culture. Moreover, another big one, and I think that this is a huge difference. It might not have once been, but as you've said, social democracy has changed from the past to the present. It would be a greater concern with unions in general, and even arguably the attempt, while very difficult, to form unions.
So I guess the question I was trying to pose, it was like a concrete sort of question. It's like on a day-to-day level, what do you do that a SOCDEM would not? So you talked about like your focus, right? The question is like, what actions do you take that a SOCDEM wouldn't, and what actions does a SOCDEM take that you would? I'm sorry, I think I misphrased that, but you get the idea.
Hmm. I think the SOCDEM would center their organizing around electoral endeavors in
Mm-hmm.
America specifically. And I believe, and I'm not going to say communist, but I will say, a revolutionary socialist. How about that?
Mm-hmm.
Would perhaps be more preoccupied with creating and facilitating the creation of institutions that make room for people to have power. For me, Bernie Sanders wasn't a socialist because of the fact that he said Medicare for all and stood with that. In fact, I think he was saying that so he got a public option. But he was truly speaking as a socialist when he said on day one, I am
Mm-hmm.
going to go and march with McDonald's workers,
Mm-hmm.
right? My concern is with helping the McDonald workers continue to agitate, continue to hold social democrats' feet to the fire, and continue to get more and more.
So I guess the thing that's interesting to me is that,
And
um,
along with that, can I give you another one, actually, just
sure.
quickly? I think a great example of something that might even resonate with you a little bit. I assume that in your ideal world, you would not believe in a minimum wage in exchange for collective bargaining rights, right?
Uh, there are if the collective bargaining rights are sectoral, as in like flattish, then yeah, but minimum wages seem to have some efficiency effects. But like that's a technical argument. Let's say sure. Let's say yes, just for the sake of the argument.
Yeah, so the thing is, I might go on the ballot and say, I want 15 bucks an hour, and fuck, do I need 15 bucks an hour?
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, however, I would sort of, focus my attentions on organizing people and, having that either be oriented ideally, right, around measures that can be taken now to help people seize more democracy in the workplace because at the level of, you know, America right now, it will be somewhat forcible seizures. We've seen remarkable labor actions recently, and they've all been wildcat. And it might even take that, right? I
But
mean, look
wildcat
at what
doesn't mean
happened in West
forcible. But
Virginia.
I guess just to interject, I'm sorry, before we get too far down this one and away from my thought because I might lose it. When I talk
Mhm.
to like left soc dems or like if you have you ever heard the term classical liberal, right? Like when I talk to classical soc
Yeah, of
dems,
course.
when I talk to classical soc dems, they too seem to share this belief that they need to like go out and unionize. They too seem to share this belief that they need to like build democratic structures. Um, I guess I'm just not like I I
You're
talked to.
advocating for 100% unions. How else?
I'm sorry.
You're advocating for 100% unionization. You
Mm-hmm.
explicitly said that. How else are
Yeah.
you going to do it without making the fucking union?
Well, I'm not disagreeing. I'm trying to say that I guess what I'm trying to say is it seems to me that like modern like leftists who are reformist, who I call soc dems for the sake of the argument, right? That or they are acting as soc dems, right? They're soc dems on the streets. Um, these people seem to advocate for very similar things as what you seem to be advocating on a day-to-day basis. So I'm just not. If the argument, right, is that like actually I'm a revolutionary because I'm willing to accept like radical change of government, then it seems to me too that you are a what is it, soc dem in the streets because most of what you talk about is like building a social democracy in the United States, um, rather than like I guess particularly usually these conversations are focused specifically on
Well, I
more.
think
Go
that, do
ahead.
you think that it means necessarily that you're building social democracy in the United States if your primary concerns are seeking out ways to enfranchise labor? That's, that is not something I hear a lot from people who explicitly call themselves social democrats.
I feel like
I know the left sock dem tendency you're talking about, and I absolutely agree. And let me tell you, in the real world, that is in fact the only kind of sock dem I come across. Granted, my chapter is pretty far left, but
mm-hmm,
it's also successfully gotten people into office.
mm-hmm.
Explicit members, not like AOC, where it was an endorsement, right?
So
And they are, I think, similarly advocating for the same things, recognizing that at the moment, in the short term, there is only so much that can be done. And it is about keeping that focus on both things. That's what I'm trying to get at,
so
right? Is
I
that
don't.
if you really want to get to 100% of anything, a true 100%, then you need to recognize that in the long term, we need an overturning of our institutions. They don't need to be a one-party. It doesn't even need to be a fucking one-party state. I would argue that you can have a even better direct democracy if it were done correctly, but I would agree with you if you said it's never been executed, right? I don't think that's necessary. However, there needs to be a fundamental shift in the way that politics relates to the average person, like on that level, right? Which can be only gained from pressure from people pushing against it. At a point, there are just fundamental limitations, right? You know, I know that this is a bit of a meme, right? But, you know, the people who wrote our Congress, you know, they were white landowning men, right? It is, and this is a country that enshrines it much more than others, right? If we were in, say, the UK, right, where their constitution is a living document, right? I might start thinking a little bit more in the framework of reforms. We don't. We live in a country where we have a very ossified legal system, and now we have one with a very conservative judiciary, unfortunately.
Well, so I guess the thinking that I would point to here is, so I don't want to get too tied into the terminology of like whether SOCDEM or socialist or whatever.
But that's the thing, is that my point is that, you know, and this is deep down, my feeling is just like, I don't like how people feel this need to differentiate themselves from one another. I am differentiating because I'm trying to sort of make a case for where I feel like other communists, typically MLs, who've not spelled things out. When I am in the streets, how about this? I'm a communist in the streets. I'm a socialist, not a market socialist, not a social democrat, no modifiers. I'm just a socialist. And I don't understand why, if we have a common short-term goal, why it is that we need to differentiate ourselves like this. And this is why I keep bringing up, you know, the historical German Social Democratic Party. It was a big tent of left to right interests. And it stayed that way until the very, very end. And, the first split was over something very valid, which was that the leadership of the party pressed hard and pushed for the World War. And I think that's more than reasonable to want to split over.
So the reason that I'm pointing to, like I keep pointing to, say, stuff like elections, is because I do come across lots of communists. If we're going to do the whole like appeal to experience sort of thing, I come across plenty of communists who seem very willing to say that they don't participate in like elections. They won't participate in reform. And they seem to think that these things are disjunct. And so I agree. I think that I agree more with you. I would say that even if you think that you want a revolution down the line, I would argue that it is strengthened by reform today. But there are some people who disagree. And so I guess the real disagreement that I'm having is not necessarily with someone like you, I guess is how I would put it, who is what I would call like a compatibilist. Have you ever heard the term compatibilism or?
I think I can glean what it means largely.
Sure, then I won't. I won't like.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just wanted to make sure.
Okay. So you know, I think that maybe I should make this clear, right? This is the reason why I contacted you actually after that leftism to debate was because it was the first time that I saw an online communist recognizing to some extent what situation we're in terms of like how do these things operate. I felt as if, you know, he did not sufficiently spell out what I wanted to talk about, which is what that has historically looked like in the West. But what if I told you that, you know, this is a plea to communists too? Stop calling yourself an anarcho-communist. Stop calling yourself an ML if you live in America. You know, stop calling yourself a Luxembourgist. She would have hated that. Like, just call yourself a socialist. We are all on the same page right now on what we need. And what I would say to the people who are sort of more on the right wing of American socialism right now is that they need to recognize that you can walk and chew gum at the same time. You know, we are fighting for short-term reforms because we don't have basic human rights. And like, I don't know if you've ever been food precarious. I can only speak personally. It's not fun. It's not fun. And it is horrific. And I can only imagine how much worse it is for everyone, since I by far had it about as good as you could in those moments when I experienced it.
Well, so I don't disagree. I guess like the way I've often had this before is there are revolutionaries I've spoken with who, let me put it to you like this. I don't disagree with you on the practical level or the short-term level. I do disagree with you on the theoretical or long-term level. And so I generally have very little like disagreement, really, or like a reason to quibble, or whatever you want to call it, with people who say like, hey, I'm willing to do reform today because I want a revolution tomorrow, because they're willing to do reform today. Most of the problem I have is with people who are unwilling to do reform today. And so the only argument I would raise, so that's the agreement on the short term. The disagreement on the long term is whether revolution is an effective strategy. And so this seems mostly to hinge on the definition of revolution. If, as you say, if you define revolution as simply like a radical change of government, something like a new constitutional convention, then again, you could consider me a revolutionary, right? I think that, again, the difference here is mostly about what types of tactics people are willing to endorse. If you're willing to endorse, say, armed uprising, it seems like there's a whole lot of reasons to believe this is ineffective. If you're willing just to say that this is just a mass popular movement, particularly one of the reasons I keep recommending Chenoweth and Stefan is both of the authors there talk about the importance of and strength of nonviolent mass movements. Basically, if you're willing to endorse that, then like sure, that's totally fine with me. If you just want to say like mass strikes, if you just want to say like call for a constitutional convention, if you just want to like fundamentally restructure the government and have new elections or something, yeah, I'm on board.
What I mean to, so I think there's a few things to note about that. One is I'm trying to say something which is just somewhat factual, which is that what I am describing, right, as the nature of revolution, the overturning of one, with power being ensured in it to a greater extent to certain figures and the increase of democracy, there is no historical precedent in the developed world of an armed insurrection or an aspiration towards that, to that degree, that has ever happened. Nevertheless, we have to acknowledge that there are revolutions that have, I would argue, succeeded on a continuum, because I personally think that you never have one vested interest in a revolution. It is always several competing forces. And what I believe, right, and ultimately my thesis on the German Revolution is that the right wing and the left wing of Germany, in their Social Democratic Party, after the right wing leader, Ebert, right, said to the Kaiser, you have to abdicate or there's going to be a revolution. Because that is what prompted it. Nevertheless, it was a popular movement that was not aligned. It was the working class uprising, right, from the mutiny, right? And out of that necessity... Right? Kronstadt is the Soviet Union. No, this is Sailor.
That was... Wait, which one was it then? No.
Kronstadt was the Soviet Union.
Okay. Which was the...
I don't recall the name of the mutiny, but basically there was a military order for a ship to continue further. And that ship did a mutiny. And then news spread, and it expanded throughout, to the point that, you had 500,000 workers on the street, right, at one point.
Sure.
Right?
So, I mean...
And in the wake of that, I'm sorry,
Sure.
With these things, it's important to spell out the whole thing.
That's fair.
And with that in mind, right, and the likelihood being there, since now the split party was agitating for an overturning of essentially the whole apparatus of, the empire state, the right wing went to the Kaiser and said, you've got to go. You've got to go. And they declared a republic on the same day. There they existed in a true dual power situation, with unrest not being resolved immediately by any means, but rather it having its peaks and troughs. And in the end, the far left continued further, and there were strikes of all ideological variations for the left. And initially, the first split was with the left and the center, which includes people like, say, Karl Kautsky. And, ultimately then, what happens, right, is that the left wing of the USPD, the Independent Social Democrats, led by the Spartacists, say, okay, we sympathize with the workers, right, who are still out there, even though it is no longer as overwhelming as it once was. We believe in these. We are going to separate, and we are going to see where it goes. Finally, the Spartacist uprising emerged when Rosa Luxemburg actually did not vote for this, but there was a workers' uprising, and then the party agreed to join and help facilitate and organize it, right? Give it coherence and purpose. And the uprising happened, and, that's where we started. It was quelled. And, you can call that a close, right? Basically, the terms of the revolution meant that it was a bourgeois revolution that got rid of a monarchy, because unlike the UK, it was not a perfect separation as it once was. that was spearheaded by the SPD, which was guided and oversight by the SPD, but it was the revisionist side of the SPD, including your Bernstein,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So that to me, right, says that, like, perhaps out of necessity, right, but nevertheless, every wing of the Social Democratic Party, in their own bizarre way, were forced to come together and agree, okay, no more monarchy, no matter what side they were on.
Sure.
And if the French Revolution was a progressive revolution, I would argue that this was a progressive revolution at the very least.
Sure. So the way that I'm thinking about this is how do I put this? So the circumstances of stuff like 1918 seem very unlikely to replicate themselves. The modern replications in liberal democracies tend to be like the revolutions you pointed to, right? Of like stuff in the West are like the Carnation Revolution, which was in a fascist dictatorship, basically. The like dying breaths of a fascist dictatorship. Similarly in Spain, which I believe that was, I don't know if that was the Rose Revolution, but I think it might have been.
Yeah.
In contrast, it just doesn't seem like you get these kinds of things you don't get revolutions in liberal democracies so far. You get revolutions to, but not revolutions in.
You know, I think that, the argument you're making here is a little unfalsifiable.
Okay.
Right? Again, in the scope of history, I really don't think 100 years is that long a period of time.
Well, but instead 100 years, right, we've seen virtually every fascist dictatorship rise, have a revolution of some kind, and fall. We've seen every revolutionary government rise, either have like some sort of internal failure, like the USSR and Yugoslavia, which you can disagree if you want to call it internal failure or external. That wasn't the point. Have a failure of some kind and fall, or like have a like political change, like China or Vietnam, and in a certain sense fall from socialism. So in that time, we've seen all these enormous changes. Why would we think that democracy, like liberal democracy rather, would be like uniquely just this like monolith of never ever getting revolted, unless there is some truth to the idea that it's like more stable, which is something that we observe empirically, that it is more stable.
I think that maybe this is the best thing to do is there's a question. Is there an idea of, and be honest with me, is there an idea of a state that's coming in your head and feels a little Russian? Just be honest. When are you imagining that the Russian state popping up in your brain right now?
Popping off? Question mark? What do you mean?
Popping up.
Popping up?
So as you're sort of making the statement that you're making, when you say the word revolution, do you feel Russia?
I mean, I guess, yes, I am talking usually about a mass popular revolution, but I would also just say, in general, we haven't also seen like many palace coups in democracies, and certainly not socialist ones. Like that's, I guess, the most of the palace coups we've seen have been coups to fascism, not to socialism.
But we've had 100 years of liberal democracy as well, and I don't think that's enough time for us to be able to say the jury's out, right? And in fact, wouldn't it make sense considering,
my claim is not an absolute one; it's a relative one, right? It's that it's relatively unlikely. Whereas on the other hand, we already do have evidence that we can push it to the left via reform. I guess that's the classic argument. Whereas the argument that we need to like wait for a revolution, which is again, that's something that some people say, particularly those who are like more accelerationist or anti-electoralist, that doesn't seem to hold water.
Yeah. Okay, so basically, I think that what you are saying is again sort of struggling to conceive of things in motion, right? Because again, we both agree there is value in short-term reforms that I simply just don't consider central to the question of socialism. In terms of like, we are acting as concerned citizens and because we care about our communities, right? Actually, my conception of reform is like a fairly conservative notion if you think about it. But I think that really just thinking about this as we are all individuals saying, yes, we want this for each other, right? There's something powerful in that. And it shifts people's perception. What I think, though, right, is that, and I think you agree with me, we want more, though, right? If we get one, we have to keep going and going and going and going.
Sure.
And that aspiration for keeping going, for no longer saying stop, right, and adapted by any means necessary to do that. Again, every single socialist society notably has had to work with the market in some capacity. They were failed market socialisms, perhaps, but they were market socialisms.
I mean, you could definitely in Yugoslavia, definitely in an even weaker degree in like Czechoslovakia. There were markets, but in like the USSR, the markets there were extremely limited, to the point that they would be like negligible. It'd be like talking about American state-owned enterprises. They exist, but they're just, we don't care.
Yeah. So can I actually give you an example of one country I know of that has successfully achieved the things that you're describing through reform? The only one I know of?
Sure.
Singapore.
Okay.
Actually. Right? And in the case of Singapore, the big rationale that Lee Kuan Yew always gave, right, was we have to keep going and going, right? We have to keep going because if we let opportunists in, it'll fuck shit up. And by the way, I know the way to go. And to the credit of him, right, if you are an authoritarian, you know, you'd be hard-pressed to find a state builder quite like Lee Kuan Yew, even though I disagree with many things. But, you know, at the end of the day, that state owns a huge amount of the land in Singapore. The majority of the people are housed in public housing, right? And, you know, they have a fairly consistent safety net. And what's interesting, right, is that it was another case of a social democratic party that purged their left wing. And Lee Kuan Yew himself actually began as a labor lawyer. And so what I mean to say, though, right, is it seems as if there's never been a case where reforms can go all the way. And because of the fact that I think you should keep going always, and that is a central element of socialism, and that's what separates the socialists from the progressives. If we are at 95%, right, it is very possible that at 95% you'll have enough is enough, right? You know, there will be enough wealth to drum up tension, right? And there will be aggression enacted on the reformist movement that has gone so far, right? I mean, what happened to Allende?
So I guess the way that I'd put this is,
and like you can't blame it on like you cannot blame it on inflation. That is the expert round.
So the way that I'd put this is, many countries went to some degree further than Allende. If we want to think about, like, I point to Sweden just because they have a big tax bill, right? It's like 50% of GDP. Chile was nowhere close to that. Chile nationalized some firms, right? But like the state ownership of like the wealth in the country was much smaller than it was again in like Sweden. It seems like you can go substantially further than like in Chile, and not have people coup you.
There's a big difference, and this is what gets you cooed. Allende was vocally committed to continuing in that direction. And if we want another example of a place, and this is the tragedy, right? Allende and that government was beginning models on, you know, cybersyn, right? Which would have been, you know, equivalent to computers being embraced by Gosplan.
Yeah.
Right? They were doing it. It was in motion, right? And the hope was that this could be a genuine tool to deal with things like the inflation problem. And I know you're familiar enough with this that you can say it might even posit some alternatives, right? And it was a crisis. But nevertheless, right, there was a concerted effort from the very beginning because he said, I am going to keep moving left. I am committed to keep moving left. This is the Chilean way to socialism that moves through our institutions.
So it's possible that's specifically the reason why. I think that, so I've pointed before that there were like many structural factors in the Chilean economy that were weakening at the time, like super high inflation due to I believe this was like right after the oil crisis, right? So like there was pretty high inflation in most countries in the world at the time. Chile got even higher due to a collapse
reliance on copper also.
Collapse of copper prices plus increase of state expenditure led to a sort of trade imbalance, and the way the government paid the trade imbalance and a deficit spending is with money to some degree. As I recall, the stats are that near like Allende's death, it was reaching like 600% inflation, which is very high.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
So the I guess the suggestion here is it seems like it's much more plausible to me that like the reason it fell apart is because there was like an economic crisis, and so in economic crises you can move people to do stuff like palace coups, particularly when you've got the backing of the United States government like implicitly, if for this kind of like move to the right.
Yeah, I mean, also keep in mind that they had been working on this for several years beforehand.
So as I understand it, my brief reading into this is that the Pinochet coup was not planned by the CIA, but there was another coup that had fired and failed previously.
But they were the people who were introducing the ideology in there, right? I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the Jakarta method, right? It wasn't as if, America hops in overnight and is like, hey guys, let's do the coup. They have to massage it a little bit.
Of the United States.
Right?
The suggestion here is more just like, I think that the combination of factors here seems to be what is mainly at play. And in particular, one of the reasons that I often argue for reform, in particular in the first world, is it seems like when you do these reforms in the third world, as you're saying, you do get couped. But who is often the agent behind those coups? It's often not domestic capitalists. It's maybe, to some degree, domestic capitalists, domestic power holders, but also, to a big degree, foreign capital holders, like the United States, foreign powers. And so if you change those foreign powers to be much more amenable to social democracy, you can see social democracy expanding. And so I think it's worth noting that even during the neoliberal period, right, which to some degree has seen the rise of like right-wing parties, and people talk about neo-imperialism, but even during the neoliberal period, there has been a substantial increase actually of like social welfare in the third world, of a move towards
Absolutely.
like beginning social democracy in the third world. So I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of the things that previously the United States would join and crush countries for is now actually relatively widespread. So I guess the basic take here is like, it seems like you can it seems like if you can reform the United States, you can make reform in other countries easier. If you can reform Europe, you can make reform in other countries easier. There's a multiplicative effect.
Absolutely. Again, it's not a question of one, it's a question of all. And to continue to be influential in that way, you have to be in a continuous state of pushing for reform while simultaneously saying, why are there limitations? Why is there resistance? We should be moving for these things. And especially at this point, we really should. It's kind of insane that we don't have certain basic things, frankly, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just, and it's shameful. It's absolutely shameful, which is why I'm not opposed to that. And we are in full agreement that we are about to enter Africa's moment in the sun. And yes, capitalism is maturing there, right? I mean, that's the next destination after, they move through Southeast Asia a bit more, right? The Chinese are already preparing for that.
I mean, that's fundamental. So like one of the reasons that I don't subscribe to what's often called the collapse thesis, that like revolution is coming because the system will collapse, is it just doesn't seem like it's collapsing. There's something, if you want to read about it, it's called the Great Moderation. There's been like an enormous increase of stability actually of economic systems over time, in part due to like the adoption of Keynesian policies and the adoption of other economic stabilizers. The other main one seems to be actually, speaking of Pinochet, inflation stabilization has been one of the really big things. The IMF doesn't do a lot of good, but inflation stabilization is one of those few things that seems to genuinely be a good thing for like global economic growth. So
sure, I guess I'm struggling to see sort of where the disagreement.
Well, I think the reason is that like most revolutionaries, in addition to advocating in the long term, advocate it in the short term. And so if you don't advocate in the short term, we don't disagree on much. The question fundamentally becomes, when do you start trying to push for revolution? When is it? So let me turn the question around. You asked the question, we'll reach a point at which the reforms go too far and the capitalists will kill us, right? They'll just be like, well, no more reforms. When, for you, conversely, is the point at which like we've gone far enough, we've hit that reform point, we're not going to be able to push the capitalists anymore, and now it's revolt time. How do you know when we get there, and what do you do?
Yeah, I mean, so are you familiar with the concept of base and superstructure?
Yeah.
Right.
If you for the benefit of the audience, I just do this all the time. For the benefit of the audience, could you please explain?
So quite simply, right, what it refers to is a cyclical process, right? And I mean, this is, where we begin to sort of understand like the idea of a contradiction that becomes an idea that's constantly in motion. And basically, the belief is that when you change modes of economic organization, that necessarily has implications on social and political organization and cultural output and even elemental basic social relations. And, I think that's ultimately the driver that is compelling for so many people, especially a certain kind of like middle class person, I guess. That said, I will say that, day to day, I mean, most of the leftists I meet are actually working class.
50. Sorry, I just gotta do some math in my head. Okay.
But what I mean to say also, moreover, right, is just the fact that like at some point in this process, over time, as we continue to move to new forms of social organization, in part through the reforms, but in part through the necessary implications of these reforms, which would be people beginning to take action and demand more labor rights, right? As we're seeing with cultural issues, right? And you're right, the world is turning in it is always turning ultimately in a progressive direction, right? And that's the cause of optimism in, a socialist perspective, right? Is that, as the interesting thing, right, is that as things get better, people realize that they deserve better.
That is one of the things that I do want to point to. Often I find people talk about this, and again, I don't want to just say they're Marxist-Leninists. Just like people from more of the revolutionary side tend to talk about this from what I would almost see as like an accelerationist sort of perspective, where it's like people, as things get better, people get pacified and they stop demanding things better. But if anything, it seems to be the reverse. There's something which I call it the policy adoption bias. I don't know if there's a formal name for it. After policies are adopted, people often shift their beliefs to be more in line with the adopted policy. So like as you shift economic policy left, it seems to in turn become easier to make people have economic left beliefs. So I'm agreeing.
That sounds like a very good sort of sociological analog to what I'm describing. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, well, what I feel bad saying this, right? But I think that at the end of the day,
my thin skin.
A lot of those people just aren't very familiar with the theory, and I actually think would have a more dynamic approach if they looked at the theory and looked at the history of left movements in the West. That doesn't mean you don't admire and, celebrate the accomplishments of the developing world, but it is recognizing that, Marxism, Leninism is not going to be the revolutionary ideology that is the vehicle of the revolution. Like, yes, absolutely. And part of what I'm like also trying to do is give a kind of a plea, and I'm not talking about all of them, and I really don't want to do that. And I would even go and say that there are some very, very, very thoughtful and intelligent Marxist-Leninists that you can see on YouTube. I actually think that while he's a little too
You
STEM.
mentioned prolate cult, right? Or
yeah, that's a little more on the cultural side of stuff, which is why I'd recommend it, since that is really, I think, the missing piece. And I think it would actually answer a lot of questions for many of these people. I'm not here just to talk to you. I really am actually kind of trying to speak to multiple audiences at once.
All 58 viewers of the esteemed SDL stream. Okay.
I mean, if they just talk to their friends with different beliefs and like something happens, it's still better, right? Because I think at the end of the day, the only thing that makes sense right now is that like everyone goes under a unified banner, recognizing that there is a shared short-term goal. And, maybe there can be a debate internally, but like, why do you need to call yourself a market socialist instead of just a socialist?
Sure. So the reason I do that is in part because I think that part of the reason that we saw the failure, I would say, of socialist revolutionary movements was an under-theorization of what came next. I've often shared this piece that I quite liked discussing Marx's rejection of markets, which basically argues that though he argues well that markets have problems, he fails to argue well that non-market solutions like planning solve those. And so I think that insufficient planning about transition and the aftermath are in fact to blame in part for the failures. So that's the reason why I call myself that, because I want to explicitly lay out a vision of what is to come next, and therefore try and avoid catastrophe, or at least I guess reduce its scope or whatever. That's the idea there.
Well, I would say that I just think that it's a kind of closed-minded perspective to keep framing this as like a dead ideology, right? I mean, you heard about the general strike in India, right?
Mm-hmm. That one seems hard to frame, though, as explicitly socialist, though, because in particular...
No, it's a coalition. What have I been talking about this whole time?
Well, no. I guess what
How
I'm trying
coalitions in the short term are just as valuable, but that it's all about one in the other, one of the other, walking and chewing gum.
Sure. So I guess... Excuse me. Oh, excuse me. The basic thesis that I'm trying to get at is like... how do I put this? If... well, so let me try to return a little bit to the basics of the question. So I asked you, how would you know the point at which you know it's time to revolt, right? So like, because so far you're a classic phrase that I like to use is instead of either or, it's both and, right? So you're both and for reform or revolution, right? So you don't want one or the other, you want both and the, like both of them or one and the other. Is that a decent summary?
The one of is a critical aspect of that as well. If you understand what I'm getting at when I say that.
No. Clarify.
The process to get... We need reforms because of the fact that we need things. Revolution is not a guarantee, which is all the more reason why I say it should always be at the back of your mind. To some extent, it is a question of trying to work and build meaningful relationships with, you know, your communities and the working class, and recognizing other sides of it, right? You know, I know, for example, that, you know, while labor is always very difficult, you know, a lot of people around me have had great success with grassroots tenants' rights organizing, right? That might be a site. You know, it's certainly a place where there's a very pronounced class relation, right? And
Yeah,
I think that to some extent, did you know that people would go and burn down the police station?
In like the BLM stuff?
But specifically day one. Did you know it was happening?
I mean, I was aware that it was happening. I'm sorry. So where are you going with the police station stuff? I'm sorry.
That I'm saying, right? I mean, it is the it's the goal of you know, I think socialists of all classes and all tendencies to, you know, try to work to help, you know, build an organizing principle in a chaotic situation. Are all situations fruitful? No, right? But that's why you analyze a situation and assess piece by piece. Until then, the goal, I really think, is ultimately to help ensure people get fed and have shelter, to help enfranchise people through things like the labor movement, through tenants' rights organizing, and additionally, to critically support people who, by the way, really do inspire me, like AOC or Ilhan Omar, but definitely always hold their feet to the fire if, you know, they are not committed to, and it's not a question of playing ball. Let me be clear, right? Sometimes it's the right time to do it. Sometimes it's the wrong time to do it, right? But there are several situations. A very straightforward one, right, is when AOC, you know, was contacted by several people from Bolivia before everything came up into the open, right? And, you know, they said, this thing is going on in Bolivia, you know, we're fighting for democratic rights, so on, so on, so on, right? And so, you know, she goes and she says something supporting it. And then, you know, the obligation is to say, what the fuck are you doing? Right? Something like that. Or, you know, on a much more immediate end, right? It might not necessarily be Medicare for all specifically, but it might be qualify your vote in some way, right? Which she did, notably
That was
in the
PAYGO,
end.
yeah.
Which she
I was
did,
just going to mention that.
right?
Oh, God.
And that is the role, right? It is not necessarily to focus on those electoral activities, right? If you have the time to canvass and such, sure, but your daily political life should not entail a sort of large focus exclusively on electoral politics. Because that's also just much more conducive to hobbyism and like spectator sports bullshit. Anyway, and I think you can agree with that.
Well, so yes and no. So I'm sorry to really try and press. So I've been letting you speak about it a lot. Um, I I'll answer in twofold. One, I do agree that electoral politics and debating about it and so on can very much fall into like hobbyism. It's like watching from the sidelines, watching the drama, right? People are checking it every day on the New York Times. That stuff doesn't always matter. Usually the stuff that does matter in electoral politics is stuff like canvassing, it's stuff like calling your senator. That stuff isn't the stuff that people find enjoyable or like the hobby. So I do agree that there can be a tendency there. If I had to offer a parallel critique, I think that there is often there's a certain level of like fun or like purism in being able to say like, hey, I'm the revolutionary, I don't engage in like electoral politics, like really organizing the working class. But that's beside the point. I don't need to, the point is not throw jabs. I am trying to hold your feet to the fire, right? So you are my AOC, right? You are my my shining beacon of hope, and I'm holding you to the fire. How do you know, like, what happens that tells you it's time to revolt, that reform is over? Like, what concrete event happens?
It's taken several forms, right? You know, some have been civil wars, others have been very significant wars, and others have been when the government stops serving its purpose very well. Those are several situations. And I think at the end of the day, right, you know...
These seem to be all things that virtually everyone would agree with, though, right? Like, virtually everyone would be like, hey, if the government goes fascist, you know, I'm willing to abandon my adherence to, like, nonviolence resistance or something.
Right, so that's one side. And then the other side is, again, right, these things don't happen spontaneously. What does happen spontaneously, right, however, is uprising of sorts, right? They just happen. That's why I asked the question about George Floyd, right? However, I think it is the goal of people, you know, who believe in socialism to try to help those people realize there's an organized way we can do it. And there is a system of governing ourselves that will be more democratic and will have greater room to grant us our needs, right? And to some extent, you cannot speak for people in that. The only thing you can do is try to expose them to a way that gives them access to the maximum possibility. If we've gone through a period of reform already, right, and you've gained the trust of these people, when you hit that breaking point, right, I mean, to some extent, you know, you have already existed in the brain since you've been working in the short term and trying to enfranchise people, right? Because doing nothing is stupid. I agree with you, right? But we're talking about the essence and the principles of this stuff, not about some like misinformed person on the internet.
Sure.
And these things are important. And, you know, look, at the end of the day, I know people who have had real accomplishments in like left organizing. Like, this thing isn't all like a game on the internet. People do real shit.
Sure. So I guess then,
you know,
in the long summary, so I guess if I wanted to wrap all this up, like, I guess I just don't know that we have really fundamental disagreements. Like, it seems to me like the only disagreement we're going to have is at some theoretical point in the future where it's not entirely clear when, there's going to be some corner we turn, and after we turn that corner, reform is no longer going to be possible because the capitalists are going to like kill us for it. And now we need to revolt. But we don't know when that point is, and we won't know until we get closer to it. And so in the short term, it sounds like you and I are going to have like politically virtually identical goals.
Well, no, because you're not thinking about the long term, and I am. And I have, in fact, given you several factors already that, at the very least, are things you can keep your eyes peeled on and say, this will fundamentally change our conception of what it means to be a person, to the point that, yeah, you can get a sense of oncoming trends that might yield this, right? You can. And that has been the motivating factor already for reformists too, right? So we do kind of agree. However, I think that, you know, you are insufficiently appreciating that it is very unlikely that these problems will be solved in the short term, even in the short-term frame that you gave me, right? And the implications of that are inconceivable to us, but they will be tremendous.
Well, okay. So I feel like this might then be a good wrapping up point for the stream then.
Mhm.
Since it feels like we've gotten
Yeah,
to...
we've been going off. I still didn't
It's
talk
been
to you
2
about
hours.
foreign policy.
Yeah.
Which bumps me out because I do actually. That's the thing I felt more strongly about also.
Sure. Well, I mean, if you want to talk again, we can find another time
Yeah,
to skip
I'd
talk.
be happy to do a foreign policy conversation at some point as well. I hope I didn't come off too contentious or anything.
This conversation was... I mean, I was screaming, I was crying, I was very upset. I pissed once. It was very contentious. I don't ever want to see or hear from you again. No, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, I just hope that these guys don't dox me, Don't send them. But yeah, it was fantastic. And yeah, I mean, if you'd be interested in, discussing that other topic, I just want to introduce, and if I could just make one closing remark.
Sure. Well,
I am speaking to both the far left and the right of the far left.
Mm-hmm.
And saying to both sides, you need to recognize the way that what you want to do is intertwined.
Sure.
And both of you need to be keeping in mind the other side. And that is the real way that we will, quote, win, unquote, whatever that means.
Sure. I mean, it sounds like, so to me, it sounds like there's more disagreement than, there's more agreement than disagreement. I'll offer just an anecdote. There was a guy recently that wanted to do a little mini interview with me because what they were trying to do is they're trying to ask a whole bunch of people in online spaces, like content creators in particular, what they think about various issues and to try and prove that they agree more than they disagree on these sorts of things. And so to me, most people that I've run across tend to fit like the sort of frame that you're talking about, where lots of people, even though a lot of people in your position actually call themselves reformists, and they say the same thing though. They're like, I'm reformist until the foreseeable future, and at a certain point it will become revolutionary. But they call themselves reformists because de facto it's like that's where they are for 50 years or something. That's not trying to like change your terminology. You can use whatever term you like. That's not important.
No, but the thing is, again, I think, and maybe this is, I don't want to stretch it out too long.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing I would like to stress is that when you really get down to the core of it, and I really think where that hot point is not so much this today, that tomorrow. They are always already fundamentally intertwined, and they will continue to be.
Sure. So I guess why don't we close it off there before things go too long, because it has reached 2 hours.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, this has been a real marathon. Yeah, and thank you so much for having me on. Once again, shout out to the Discord.
Well, on that note, if you had to, this is the shill period, right, for you. So if you want to tell us who you are, what you do, and if you want people to follow you, they can do that. Or if you want to shill anything else, you can also do that. What would you like to shout out?
My name is Pranav. I am a social worker, and I would recommend, as I said, Proletult. I would say reading Marx, perhaps, if you are curious about Marxist theory, is not the best idea to start, but rather to read Engels first. I would also recommend that, people explore the, territory often scorned of cultural Marxism. But also, the general tradition of, Marxist philosophy that you see, in parts of both the West and the Eastern Bloc, like Lukács or Herbert Marcuse. These are actually some of Zizek's biggest influences, which is how you end up with such a heterodox thinker. And yeah, I would also invite you to just look up what does dialectics mean, and just look at that.
If you had to name one book that would be the most useful, I know we're constantly saying read theory. If you had to recommend one book written after, let's say, like 1950 or so, one modern book, modern-ish, right? What book would that be?
Well,
I think you mentioned Marcuse, for example, but
well, I would say that for for I think maybe the internet crowd, there's a great book called The Uprising by a guy named Biffo Berardi. And it is basically a text about the revolutionary potential of irony. How about that?
Could you spell the author's name?
Biffo is Bifo.
Bifo. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Franco Biffo Berardi.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And then What would be another? What would be another good one? God, it's just so many are coming to mind. I mean, anything by Mark Fisher in terms of trying to understand, the way that these things move. He himself was a social democrat largely, but his study of the way that ideas have moved through history is very informative to anyone, regardless of their belief, left or right, I would argue.
Sure.
But he definitely has his roots in Marx. Yeah.
Fisher's term capitalist realism has certainly permeated the landscape. So, lots
Oh,
of good
like
books.
crazy. I would recommend Ghosts of My Life as well, though, which is
Okay.
a collection of essays. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank
And
you.
with that, I'll
And
probably
have a good
wish you
night.
a good evening. Thanks for coming.
Absolutely. Yeah. Have a good night. All right. Bye.
See ya. Commie boy tired. Is the R slur banned in chat? Sure, Pinkwug. It's really up to you. Radical freedom. I thought that was a pleasant conversation. I guess I feel like the strongest argument that could be raised and the R word I think it should be banned, right? I basically apply the server rules to the Twitch rules, but I can't tell you what to do. Charlotte, please be nice. I felt the strong points. I want to do. What do you mean up to me? I promised I wouldn't do shit as much. Look, Pinkwug. Then don't do anything, right? Then it's up to you. Howdy, boys. So, strong points of Pranav's arguments I felt were the classic both and the classic reform and revolution sort of argument that like, hey, once you've done enough revolution, maybe there's a point at which there is no longer a way to gain additional rights, additional economic rights via democracy, and you need a sort of radical break. And in particular, their framing of revolution is a relatively moderate or wide one, which includes stuff like sort of palace coups. You destroyed me with your arguments there, SDL. I truly did. Including those, I think that like by that argument, I would be a revolutionary. I think that virtually everyone would, right? Like I think there is no reasonable person who would not say that like if the government goes tyrannical, or if you believe that like democracy is like destroying freedom or something, that you could not like try to alter the political system in means outside of like the legislative norms. I think that that's very few people I think would disagree with that. So I'm willing to defend that. But I would consider that fundamentally a reformist position. I would say that the weakest point, conversely, was they couldn't name the point at which like revolution becomes necessary, which fair enough, maybe it's an abstract point. But the reason I ask it is because of a theoretical argument. It's that there has been this long trend of the expansion of the welfare state and the expansion of workers' rights. So the question then becomes, when is it that we hit this point and suddenly the bourgeois have been like, well, you've been taking 50, 60, 70% of our money, but we won't let you take 71%. It's sort of this argument like, why is there a sudden point at which that happens? And one argument that I felt I did weekly on is I really wanted to talk a little bit about what I often frame in terms of Michael Brooks, is this idea that the more power that we take, the less power they have to resist. So it's quite possible that there is in fact a point. Let's imagine that there is a point at which capitalists would not cede any more power, right? Let's say it's at 72% of the economy or something. Drawing up lines of argumentation in Photoshop or something, because there was a lot circling around that conversation. It would have stopped the circling. Maybe. I mean, to be fair, I was also like playing a video game. I felt also that neither of us, I felt like in particular, I didn't really want to push Pranav on something. I really didn't want to push Pranav to like defend a position or something. I mostly just wanted to explore their argument. I try to be very non-confrontational, but maybe I should have been more confrontational. Maybe that makes for better content. Maybe it's more educational to both them. And myself. I don't know. So I need AutoCAD. Why would I need AutoCAD? What do I need AutoCAD to draw like argument? I don't need 3D space for arguments. This isn't some 4D chess. So I felt like that argument, I think, is very neatly responded to by the argument that as we take more power, it is harder for the capitalists to resist. So then when the capitalists are like, it's time to revolt, they start doing their like Ayn Rand's John Galt, retreat to Galt's Gulch sort of thing, where like all the needs data for debate prep. Where they all like retreat and like flee the economy, where like all the capitalists just pack up and go. At that point, you've already got a government possibly powerful enough and with enough left-wing support that you can just stop them. It just doesn't matter anymore. I would like harder pushback, helps my own arguments. Maybe. I just feel really bad about doing that. I just don't like being confrontational anymore, but maybe I should. People have mentioned that it makes me not stand out on panel, so maybe it's useful for like the brand as well. So I don't know. So I guess summary: strong point, reform and revolution. Weak point, couldn't say when revolution. And weak point, couldn't explain why revolution necessary. Would be, I guess, the arguments there. I wish I'd pushed a little stronger on the third one, but I felt like it was a decent conversation overall. Very pleasant. For future editor self, this is probably where you should cut it. This guy is the slightly more left boring Destiny. 10 out of 10. Sorry for being boring Destiny. You can push back while being nice. Maybe. I mean, I tried to be like, hey, I really want an answer to this, but I didn't want to like interrupt them. I don't know. Maybe I should.